Hi, I'm Mr. Wahlberg, and I'm glad you're here. When most people think about the Roaring Twenties, they think about the huge economic expansion that made popular consumer life so possible. It's that business of America that really drives the engine of the cultural growth and the social growth of the decade. So, dear students, incline your ear and hear our stories that you might find your place among his delights. We have three objectives today. By the end of this class, you should be able to, number 7, summarize the role of education and mass communication to American culture. You should be able to describe how new technology affected life in the 1920s, and you should be able to explain how the country's economic growth was masking the real economic weaknesses of the decade. But let's begin in Roman numeral number 7. Here I want to talk about one of my favorite subjects, that of school. And school enrollments were just really booming in the post-war years of the 1920s. They jumped with the prosperity and the higher standard of living that was just pushing through the country, as well as the demand for industry jobs that took a higher educated worker. Before the Great War, before World War I, there was around 1 million United States students in high schools. But by 1926, by mid-decade of our unit here, that number had basically quadrupled to around 4 million people. Before the 1920s, the only students who attended high school were the ones that were going to be going off to college. But in the 1920s, high schools began to offer vocational training classes for industrial jobs. Public schools were also expected to educate non-English speaking immigrant children. And the immigration boom of those pre-war years brought a baby boom to go fill American classrooms. As a result of quadrupled school enrollment, expanded programs, and complicated instructional needs, school taxes increased sharply as schools, really tried to. All their costs grew as well. The cost of education was totaling $2.7 billion a year, and it was the most amount of money our country had ever spent on education. Subpoint B, a newly educated country was hooked on reading. Just, that happens. The more you know, the more you like reading, I think. It seems like it. Anyway, a newly educated country was hooked on reading the newspapers. While the newspaper business went through new growing pains of all this new demand. You see, in the years before the war, hundreds of local newspapers were replaced by national chain newspapers, giving more expansive news from major cities. This was the era of thriving, mass market news magazines. They summarized foreign and domestic news. The rise of some brands that still exist today, Reader's Digest and Time Magazine, they each claimed a circulation of over 2 million people. Radio, though, was the most powerful communications medium of the 1920s, and new words emerged for this new technology. Things like airwaves and the radio audience, and to tune in joined everyday speech. Networks provided their share of the national experience. People could now hear news while it happened, whether it was the voice of their president or baseball's World Series. America could all hear it at once. Subpoint C, advertising agencies then, with all of these new medium of national publications and, radio networks, this is a huge market for advertising to grow in, and advertising agencies decided to lean in extra good on this one, and they hired psychologists to go learn how people think so how they could go appeal to the public. They made brand names nationwide and pushed luxuries as necessities. For instance, the phrase, "say it with flowers," it doubled florists' business between 1912 and 1923. Or, today I don't think the Surgeon General would say this is a good diet plan, but reach for a Lucky, like a Lucky Strike cigarette. Reach for a Lucky instead of a Sweet. It pushed cigarette smoking as a weight loss plan. Listerine tried to convince people that bad breath could keep a girl from a happy marriage and thus be just a failure as a person. To improve their image, business people also needed to go step up their public relations, and they began working with service groups. They promoted themselves as benefactors for society, that businessmen weren't just good at making money, they were good for America because they were members of the Rotary and the Kiwanis and the Lions Clubs. They would sing songs and raise money for charity and boosted the image of a businessman, not as just a person driven by hard dollars, but as a philanthropist and as a benefactor of everybody in the service of humanity. And a lot of people considered businessmen to be real heroes. Roman numeral number 8. As America's standard of living was growing in this economic prosperity, we see that people end up with I think we could objectively say, living what looks like a better life. The average annual income rose by 35% from, in a year earning $522 as an average income to $705 as an annual income. Now, those don't sound like a lot of, they're not big money today, but those are real dollars. And that wealth changed the way that Americans lived. Factories began using electricity to rerunning machines, and the development of alternating current power made it possible to distribute that electricity over large distances and electrifying the suburbs. In 1920, just 35% of American households had electricity. By 1929, 68% of American homes were electrified. Most farms weren't electrified. Here we're talking about the urban focus that we'd mentioned in a previous class. By the end of the 1920s, more homes began to have electrical appliances, which made housework easier, freeing women for other activities. These appliances also coincided with a trend of women working outside the home, making it all more possible. Subpoint B, cars also changed just the look of American life. The automobile, I'm not sure that there's any single technology that affected life as much as the car did, but man, what a deal. It changed the way that America just looked as a country. We had paved roads and gas stations and motels, a motor hotel that you could just drive up to and go stay in, shopping centers stretching across the country. It changed actually the footprint of America. Take, for instance, Route 66. It was a highway, a legendary westward route from Chicago to Los Angeles, and towns that were along Route 66 became culturally and economically important as the stops along the highway. Little Radiator Springs, Radiator Springs is a fictional story. It's in Cars. But it's a real kind of thing. These towns became really important if they were on the highway. Other highway developments included the Woodbridge Cloverleaf, the first Cloverleaf intersection built in New Jersey that allowed people to change directions on the highways faster without stopping and improving, efficiency and real safety. Cars also gave mobility to people that lived on the outskirts of society, the rural families and women and young people. It gave them freedom and independence to reach far beyond their homes. It let workers live a long way from their jobs and led to suburban sprawl. Automobiles changed the architecture of people's lives, with garages and driveways being added to American houses. And like I said, motels and repair shops and gas stations and tourist camps and shopping centers, they all sprung up to go support this brand new car life, and they were also enabled by the same kind of car life. The auto industry became the boom to certain cities like Akron, Ohio, and Detroit, and Dearborn, and Flint, and Pontiac in Michigan. They grew up to go support automobile manufacturing. Oil-producing states like California and Texas became key to a petroleum industry and made fast profits from their resources. By the late 1920s, there was one car for every 5 Americans, and the automobile was the status symbol of choice. Americans owned 80% of all of the cars on Earth were American-owned cars, and it was the perfect symbol of the Coolidge era. Even people of modest means could own a life-changing machine. Subpoint C, the airplane industry was also growing at this time, and it started out as a mail service for the post office in 1918. But as training improved, air travel became more than a way of just delivering letters. It became a reliable method of transportation. Weather forecasting and mobile radios and navigation tools, they all combined with this new burgeoning airline industry to improve safety and reliability. Henry Ford, of the car fame, but he also was in airplane engines. He developed this tri-motor plane in 1926, and the Lockheed Company produced the Vega in 1927. It was a popular single-engine transport plane, and all of a sudden, this new technology of the future is the technology of now. Inspired by the transatlantic flights of Charles Lindbergh in 1927 and Amelia Earhart a few years later in 1934, Pan American Airways opened in 1927 for international airmail and passenger service, and suddenly the world is something that can be reached by Americans. Roman numeral number 9. But I think it's important to know that for all of this prosperity, if you scratch the surface a little bit, you'll see that it's pinned up on some maybe a shaky underpinnings, because we were producing great quantities of goods. Our factories were really humming, and productivity was increasing and business was expanding. And that expanded business promoted mergers in the auto industry, in the steel industry, electrical equipment, and utilities. Chain stores also continued to develop, while national banks were allowed to create branches within the cities of their main office. But while businesses were growing, there was also a growing gap between the workers workers and the managers. The businessmen and the management were getting wealthier and wealthier, but you don't really see that in the working class. That gap between the two of them, that's bad for an economy. If you have like rich people and poor people, and like the gap in between them is big, that shows an unstable economy. And it showed particularly shallow growth in some industries. The iron and railroad industries, they were not prosperous. And some of the biggest companies in the country were suddenly showing real holes in their profit margins. And farms were suffering huge losses. The change of the wartime production levels, all of the goods and food and manufacturing goods to go support the war. In the years after the war, it's hard to turn off the tap and just to scale down production. And so while that's good for consumers, all of that stuff means the prices are cheap. For producers, that's bad, and particularly for farmers who can't just easily control their production along the way. Big surpluses were driving down prices, and that drives down profits as well. Subpoint B. Modern commerce also offered a brand new way to purchase goods. This new modern business system was underpinned under a modern banking system that allowed people to buy kind of expensive things, but to pay for it on what's known as an installment plan, making little payments each period, each week or month or quarter along the way. That's an installment plan, and it allowed for consumers to pay for goods over an extended period of time. They also always charge interest. That's sort of the nature of taking out over loans, and things cost more to buy them that way. And banks would go provide money at low interest rates, so people are taking out loans to go purchase more things. And advertisers loved this idea because suddenly they could sell things to goods that if you didn't have to save up for a long time, if you could pay for it a little bit. I mean, the money doesn't change really either way, but just your psychology of how you purchase things is different. Advertisers loved it. There was phrases like, hey, you furnish the girl and we'll furnish the home, and get people into buying houses all of a sudden, or enjoy it while you pay for it to eager buyers who are ready to eat that stuff up. While consumers liked installment buying, some economists and business owners were worried that installment buying was actually a sign of a sickness in the economy, an excessive economy, and fundamental weaknesses besides what looked like prosperity. Maybe the prosperity isn't that prosperous. Still, most Americans were more worried about the present than the future. Boy, it's funny how history happens, but the things stay the same. More Americans are worried about the present than the future, and a promising growing economy encouraged Americans to continue participating in this new consumer spending. This new consumer spending is the backbone of the Roaring '20s, and an exciting story that I can't wait to tell you about. Make sure you like and subscribe. God bless you.